7. January 1941. Naval General Staff Building, Tokyo, Japan. Isoroku Yamamoto sat alone at his desk as dusk settled over the capital, the windows darkening against a city already committed to a war it did not fully understand. Before him lay charts of the Pacific, fuel consumption tables, U.S. Navy ship registries, and reports on American industrial capacity that he had personally insisted on collecting. His fingers moved slowly along the line from Pearl Harbor to the U.S. West Coast, then across to the Panama Canal, then down to the Southern Resources area, as if testing the tension on a rope that might snap at any point. He could hear the muffled echoes of arguments from earlier that day, when senior Army and Navy leaders had spoken confidently about an easy victory if war came. Yamamoto had not raised his voice, but his words had cut through the room. He knew the United States. He had studied at Harvard, lived in Washington, visited American factories, oil fields, shipyards. He knew their numbers, their machines, their abundance. When he warned that Japan would face a vast, angry continent capable of building thousands of aircraft and hundreds of ships in a single year, some of his colleagues dismissed it as defeatism. Alone now, he opened his notebook and wrote in careful script that if he were ordered to fight, he could run wild for 6 months, perhaps a year, but beyond that he could guarantee nothing. He did not write this as poetry or bravado. He wrote it as arithmetic. And as he sat in that office in early 1941, he began to think what no Japanese admiral had yet dared to formalize. If war with the United States was to be survived at all, the enemy's Pacific Fleet at Pearl Harbor would have to be struck in a single devastating blow before they fully woke up. Beyond Yamamoto's quiet office, the forces that would make his private calculations decisive were moving on a scale that could be measured in millions of lives and tons of steel. Since 1937, Japan had been locked in brutal war in China, draining resources and pushing its leaders to seek oil, rubber, and minerals from Southeast Asia. In July 1940, the U.S. had begun restricting aviation gasoline and strategic materials. By July 1941, after Japanese expansion into southern Indochina, America froze Japanese assets and cut off almost all oil exports. The Imperial Navy's fuel reserves, even with strict rationing, would last perhaps 2 years at wartime usage. At the same time, American shipyards that Yamamoto had visited in earlier years were beginning to stir into a level of output no Japanese planner could match. In 1940, the United States had authorized a massive naval expansion program, adding aircraft carriers, battleships, cruisers, destroyers, and hundreds of support vessels. By the end of 1941, more than 100 new warships were under construction, and aircraft production was climbing past 19,000 planes per year. Yamamoto understood that once this latent strength was fully engaged, Japan could not win a prolonged industrial contest. Inside Tokyo's service clubs and conference rooms, younger officers spoke heatedly of spirit-defeating material, of the samurai soul overcoming American softness. Yamamoto, who had lost 2 fingers in the Russo-Japanese War and watched friends die in real battles, had no patience for slogans. His mind moved in parallel lines. On one, the personal memory of American power. On the other, the factual, unemotional figures now in front of him. These 2 lines met at one conclusion. If war was imposed by political decision, the only slim chance was to cripple the Pacific Fleet so severely at the outset that Washington might hesitate, negotiate, or at least lose the ability to strike back for many critical months. In the early weeks of 1941, those thoughts hardened from a private warning into a secret plan that would define his life. Yamamoto began to shape the idea in his own mind, before he dared commit it to the rigid structures of the Naval General Staff. He recalled war games held years earlier, where officers had assumed that any conflict would begin with traditional engagements somewhere in the Western Pacific, battleship lines arrayed in symmetrical fire. He also remembered the British attack on Taranto in November 1940, when carrier-borne aircraft had struck Italian battleships in harbor with a daring night raid that stunned naval strategists worldwide. To Yamamoto, Taranto was not an isolated trick. It was a proof of concept. If shallow water torpedoes could be modified, if pilots could be trained to hit anchored ships at close range, if surprise could be achieved at long distance, then Pearl Harbor was vulnerable. Quietly, he called in trusted subordinates from the combined fleet staff, among them Commander Minoru Genda, a brilliant air officer, and Rear Admiral Takejiro Onishi. In closed-door sessions aboard his flagship Nagato, and later at his quarters at the combined fleet headquarters in Kure, he listened more than he spoke, testing their reactions. Could a carrier task force sail undetected across the North Pacific? Could they launch several hundred aircraft at dawn against Oahu? Could they strike not only battleships, but also airfields, fuel tanks, and repair facilities? Genda believed they could, provided the Navy was willing to concentrate its carriers into a single striking force and accept the risks. Yamamoto's eyes settled on the map again. 6 carriers, escorted by battleships, cruisers, destroyers, submarines, and supply ships, steaming in radio silence through rough northern seas to launch a surprise blow on a Sunday morning. In his private moments, he felt the weight of what he was planning. He was not a fanatic. He loved card games, American cigarettes, baseball. He had opposed war with the United States in letters to friends, writing that he would rather cut off his own fingers than fight America. But if ordered, he would fight. And if he was to fight, he would do so with all the ruthlessness of a professional who understood that half measures would mean certain ruin. While Yamamoto refined his concept, the broader machinery of empire and industry formed the backdrop that made his secret plan both logical and perilous. Pearl Harbor was not an abstract symbol. It was the main forward base of the U.S. Pacific Fleet, with 8 battleships, dozens of cruisers and destroyers, submarines, tenders, and support vessels, usually in rotation, protected by coastal artillery and by the U.S. Army's airfields at Hickam, Wheeler, Bellows, and others around Oahu. By mid-1941, intelligence reports available to the Japanese Navy estimated that sinking or disabling the battleships and inflicting heavy losses on aircraft at Hawaii would temporarily remove American sea power from the Central and Western Pacific. That would give Japan a free hand to seize the Philippines, Malaya, Singapore, the Dutch East Indies, and establish a fortified defensive perimeter stretching thousands of miles. Yamamoto studied these projections knowing they were based on assumptions that men in Tokyo preferred to believe. They assumed the Americans would be shocked, perhaps even driven to negotiate if faced with the loss of their fleet. Yet his own reading of American culture and politics told him something different, that such an attack might unite the United States in total war. Even so, he saw no other path that gave Japan even a narrow opening. In meetings with the Naval General Staff later in 1941, he confronted their reluctance by a blunt threat. If his plan to strike Pearl Harbor at the outbreak of war was rejected, he would resign his command of the combined fleet. It was not theater. It was the ultimatum of a man who believed that sending Japanese sailors into a conventional war against a fully alerted America would be criminal negligence. The plan, once a set of quiet calculations in a dim office, was now moving toward reality, carried forward by a Navy that did not fully grasp how close it was bringing Japan to both its most dazzling triumph and the edge of irreversible disaster. November 1941, Hitokapu Bay, Etorofu Island, Northern Kurils. The sea was dark steel, the air bitter with wind that smelled of ice and diesel. Vice Admiral Chuichi Nagumo stood on the deck of the carrier Akagi, watching rows of aircraft lashed under tarpaulins glinting with frost. Above him, halyards cracked in the wind, signal flags whipping in the cold. It was here, hundreds of miles north of Japan, that the greatest concentration of naval air power in history had gathered in absolute secrecy. 6 carriers, Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, Hiryu, Shokaku, and Zuikaku, each carrying more than 70 aircraft, lay at anchor alongside battleships, cruisers, destroyers, oilers, and submarines. Over 350 planes in total, with pilots drawn from the most elite units of the Imperial Navy Air Service. Nagumo had been placed in operational command of the Sank strike force, but every officer knew that the architect of this unprecedented fleet was Yamamoto. He had insisted that Japan's entire carrier strength must be concentrated, not divided among distant operations. For weeks, while diplomats in Washington still talked of peace, Yamamoto's staff in Kure and Tokyo finalized every technical detail, from torpedoes with wooden fins that would prevent them from diving too deep in Pearl Harbor's shallow waters, to armor-piercing bombs converted from naval shells. The logistics of the operation were staggering. To reach Oahu undetected, the fleet would have to travel 3,500 nautical miles through winter seas without radio communication, refueling at sea from oilers that themselves had to be specially modified for the task. Each ship carried precise sailing instructions sealed in envelopes marked "Top Secret," to be opened at sea. Even the sailors were told only that they were heading north for training. Yamamoto remained behind in his flagship Nagato at Hashirajima, outwardly calm but inwardly divided. The diplomats' final attempts to reach a settlement in Washington were still in progress, but Tokyo's decision to go to war had already been made. In those tense days of late November, Yamamoto followed the coded telegrams from Tokyo, each one bringing the operation closer to the point of no return. On 26 November, the combined strike force under Nagumo slipped from Hitokapu Bay under heavy cloud cover, sailing into the North Pacific. They followed a great arc to avoid shipping lanes, their course veering toward a point roughly 230 miles north of Oahu. Every light on every vessel was blacked out. Wireless silence was absolute. For 12 days, they steamed through fog and snow, practicing flight deck drills, checking engines, calibrating compasses. On board Akagi, Air Group Commander Mitsuo Fuchida briefed his men on targets. Battleships row, the airfields, the torpedo runs. The mood among pilots was a mix of pride and fatalism. Many carried personal letters and family photographs tucked inside their flight jackets, aware that the operation might well be one way. Fuchida later wrote in his diary that he felt no joy, only the heavy sense that the next dawn would decide the fate of nations. On the morning of 6th of December, Nagumo's flagship received the final coded message: "Climb Mount Niitaka 1208." It was the prearranged order to proceed with the attack. Mount Niitaka, the highest peak in the Japanese Empire, stood in Taiwan. Its name symbolized the rising of the empire's sword. The attack was set for 8th of December Tokyo time, which corresponded to 7 December in Hawaii. While the Kido Butai, the carrier strike force, advanced through the empty Pacific, the wider world was still unaware of its approach. In Washington, President Franklin D. Roosevelt was spending the weekend at the White House, frustrated by Japan's refusal to withdraw from China and Indochina. American codebreakers had been reading parts of Japanese diplomatic messages, but the crucial operational orders were transmitted on naval channels that remained secure. In Hawaii, Admiral Husband E. Kimmel, commander of the U.S. Pacific Fleet, and Lieutenant General Walter C. Short, head of the Army's Hawaiian Department, had received warnings that war was possible, but no one imagined that Pearl Harbor itself would be attacked. Naval intelligence assumed any strike would fall on the Philippines, Guam, or British Malaya. The Pacific Fleet's 8 battleships, Arizona, Oklahoma, West Virginia, California, Nevada, Tennessee, Maryland, and Pennsylvania, lay moored in 2 neat rows at Ford Island. Of the 3 American carriers assigned to the Pacific, none were in port. Enterprise was delivering aircraft to Wake Island, Lexington to Midway, and Saratoga was in overhaul at San Diego. In the pre-dawn hours of 7th December, as Honolulu slept, more than 350 Japanese aircraft were being armed and fueled on the decks of Nagumo's carriers. The final flight order was simple. First wave at dawn, led by Fuchida. Second wave 90 minutes later. Targets prioritized by type: battleships, cruisers, and airfields. Yamamoto's plan had been set in motion with mathematical precision. The Admiral himself remained in his cabin in Japan that morning, his staff maintaining a strained silence. At 6:00 a.m. local time in Hawaii, the first wave of 183 aircraft lifted into the cold, gray sky north of Oahu, climbing through clouds to form up in groups of bombers, torpedo planes, and fighters. They flew low and fast, descending toward the island that still lay unaware beneath them. What followed in the next 2 hours would burn itself into the memory of the world. At 7:55 a.m., Fuchida's voice crackled over the attack frequency. "Tora! Tora! Tora!" Code for complete surprise. The Japanese formations swept over Oahu in successive waves. Torpedo bombers roared across the harbor at mast height, dropping their modified weapons into the water with deadly accuracy. Within minutes, Arizona took a direct hit from an armor-piercing bomb that detonated her forward magazine, killing 1,077 men in a single explosion that sent a column of fire and smoke hundreds of feet into the air. Oklahoma capsized after multiple torpedo strikes. West Virginia sank beside her moorings. California and Nevada were burning, listing heavily. Airfields at Hickam, Wheeler, and Bellows were strafed and bombed, destroying over 180 American aircraft on the ground. Civilian neighborhoods were hit by stray bombs, and hospitals overflowed with wounded within the hour. In just 90 minutes, the United States lost 2,403 dead, 1,178 wounded, 18 ships sunk or damaged, and most of its Pacific air strength crippled. The Japanese lost only 29 aircraft in the first wave, 55 in total, and 5 midget submarines. On board the Akagi, Fuchida watched the harbor through the canopy of his returning aircraft and uttered the words, "We have achieved a great victory." But even as radio operators transmitted the attack report to Tokyo, Yamamoto read it with heavy heart. He was not jubilant. To his close aide he murmured, "I fear all we have done is to awaken a sleeping giant and fill him with a terrible resolve." He was right. The American shipyards he had seen years earlier would now rise to their full height, and the industrial war he had dreaded was about to begin. 9th of December 1941, aboard the battleship Nagato, anchored at Hashirajima Bay. The sea was calm, the horizon gray, the air filled with the restrained hum of activity as couriers moved between ships bearing reports of the stunning victory at Pearl Harbor. Yet on the flagship's bridge, Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto remained motionless, staring at the latest radio intercepts from Hawaii. The first wave of euphoria had already begun to fade. He knew the United States Navy would rebuild, and he knew it would rebuild faster than anyone in Tokyo imagined possible. He had seen American shipyards on the East Coast 20 years earlier, had watched miles of cranes, slipways, and trains hauling steel without pause. He had warned that Japan could not win a long war of attrition. Now, as dispatches arrived from Hawaii, confirming the destruction of the Arizona and Oklahoma, the Admiral's expression hardened rather than relaxed. The combined fleet's staff officers around him were jubilant. Some spoke openly of following up with an invasion of Hawaii or strikes against the U.S. West Coast. Yamamoto listened without comment. His mind was already shifting to the next phase: how to consolidate Japan's early victories before the inevitable counterattack. That morning he sent a coded message to all commands. The fate of the empire depends on the rapid exploitation of this success. Prepare immediately for southern operations. The speed with which events moved in the following weeks astonished even the planners. Within hours of Pearl Harbor, Japanese forces struck across a vast arc from Hong Kong to Malaya, from the Philippines to Wake Island and Guam. In a single coordinated campaign, Japan's Navy, Army, and Air Forces launched assaults that overwhelmed Allied garrisons unprepared for the scale and timing of the onslaught. On 8 December local time, Japanese aircraft destroyed most of the U.S. Far East Air Force in the Philippines, paving the way for invasion forces to land at Lingayen Gulf. 2 days later, British battleships Prince of Wales and Repulse were sunk off Malaya by Japanese torpedo bombers, the first capital ships in history destroyed solely by air power at sea. Yamamoto watched these developments with satisfaction, but also with foreboding. The operational brilliance of his naval air arm was unquestioned, but Japan's industrial limits loomed like a wall behind every success. The Imperial Navy possessed 10 fleet carriers. America already had 7 and more under construction. Japan's annual aircraft production was barely 5,000 planes. American factories, once fully mobilized, could produce 20 times that number. The Admiral's personal staff began collecting figures from intelligence reports. The U.S. had over 130 million citizens, Japan barely 73 million. The United States oil output alone exceeded the entire Axis production combined. He knew these were not abstract comparisons. They were warnings of the storm to come. By January 1942, Japan had achieved what its strategists had deemed impossible: domination of the Western Pacific. Manila fell on January. Singapore, the Gibraltar of the East, surrendered on 15th of February with over 80,000 Allied troops taken prisoner. The Dutch East Indies followed in March, delivering the oil fields of Borneo and Sumatra into Japanese hands. At sea, the Imperial Navy reigned supreme. Carriers struck as far as the Indian Ocean, raiding British bases at Colombo and Trincomalee, sinking the carrier Hermes and several cruisers. The tide of conquest seemed unstoppable, and for a few brief months, Yamamoto's earlier prediction appeared to be wrong. Japan was not just running wild for 6 months, it was reshaping the map of Asia. Yet beneath this surface triumph, the Admiral recognized a fatal trajectory. Logistics were stretched thin. Tankers could not keep up with fleet operations. Replacement pilots were poorly trained, and raw materials had to be shipped thousands of miles through waters that were increasingly patrolled by American submarines. Reports from Tokyo were filled with prideful communiques celebrating new victories, but Yamamoto's own intelligence summaries told a harsher truth. U.S. shipyards were already producing new aircraft carriers at an unprecedented pace. The first Essex-class hulls were laid down, and aircraft production in California and New York was doubling every few months. To maintain Japan's defensive perimeter, Yamamoto needed to destroy the enemy's remaining carriers before they could threaten the empire's vast new holdings. It was a strategic necessity, and it would soon lead to the next great gamble of his career. That gamble would take form in a plan conceived during the late winter of 1942, when Yamamoto proposed to draw the U.S. Navy into a decisive battle near Midway Atoll, the small island group guarding the Central Pacific approach to Hawaii. But before that, there came a warning. On 18th of April 1942, 16 American B-25 bombers, launched from the carrier Hornet under Lieutenant Colonel James Doolittle, flew a daring raid on Tokyo and other Japanese cities. The material damage was minor, but the psychological effect was electric. For the first time in the war, the Japanese public saw that their homeland was not invulnerable. The Imperial Army, furious and humiliated, demanded retaliation and renewed urgency to push Japan's defense perimeter eastward. For Yamamoto, the Doolittle raid was proof that America's will had not been broken. He admired the audacity of the strike, even as he vowed to end such threats. Within days, he finalized the Midway operation, an intricate plan involving 4 separate carrier groups, invasion forces, and diversionary attacks on the Aleutian Islands. Its aim was to seize Midway, lure the remaining American carriers into battle, and annihilate them. Yamamoto's staff called it Operation MI. It would involve over 200 ships, the largest fleet ever assembled by Japan. Yet he knew that in complexity lay danger. Success depended on timing, secrecy, and flawless coordination across thousands of miles of ocean. The lessons of Pearl Harbor had shown what could be achieved through surprise. The coming months would reveal what happened when surprise failed. 28th May 1942. Hashirajima Anchorage, Japan. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto stood on the deck of his flagship Yamato, the largest battleship ever built, its massive guns aimed uselessly toward the mist-shrouded horizon. Around him, the entire combined fleet prepared to sail. Carriers, battleships, cruisers, destroyers, submarines, and transports. A total of more than 200 vessels spread across the inland sea. The operation ahead was the most ambitious Japan had ever attempted, the culmination of Yamamoto's belief that one decisive engagement could still cripple the United States Navy before its full industrial might came to bear. The plan, Operation MI, would strike at Midway Atoll, a tiny American outpost 300 miles northwest of Hawaii. By seizing it, Japan would extend its defensive perimeter eastward and threaten the Hawaiian Islands themselves. More importantly, Yamamoto intended to lure the U.S. carriers, Enterprise, Hornet, and Yorktown, into a trap and destroy them. The fleet's movement was a masterpiece of coordination. 4 carriers under Vice Admiral Chuichi Nagumo, a support group of battleships and cruisers, invasion transports with thousands of troops, and Yamamoto's own main body, including Yamato, providing distant cover. The scale was staggering. Over 260 aircraft aboard the carriers, 17 battleships and cruisers, and 113 destroyers and auxiliary ships. In Yamamoto's mind, it was the logical continuation of Pearl Harbor. Another bold strike, another surprise. Yet what he did not know was that the same American ingenuity he had feared had already turned the tables. Unknown to the Japanese, American cryptanalysts at Station Haipio in Pearl Harbor led by Commander Joseph Rochefort, had broken crucial portions of the Japanese Naval Code JN-25. By late May, Admiral Chester W. Nimitz, commander of the U.S. Pacific Fleet, knew that Yamamoto's next operation targeted a location the Japanese referred to as AF. To confirm it, American intelligence had Midway transmit an uncoded message that its water desalination plant was broken. When Tokyo intercepted and reported that AF is short of water, the deception was confirmed. Nimitz now knew the target, the approximate timing, and the strength of the enemy force. With that information, he assembled a counterforce built around 3 carriers, Enterprise, Hornet, and the hastily repaired Yorktown, which had been hit at Coral Sea only weeks earlier, but restored to combat readiness in just 72 hours by hundreds of Pearl Harbor dockyard workers working day and night. The odds remained grim. Yamamoto commanded 4 heavy carriers to Nimitz's 3, more aircraft, and the mightiest battleship afloat. Yet the Americans would have one advantage their enemy could not imagine. They knew where and when to strike. On 3 June 1942, the first contact was made when American reconnaissance from Midway spotted elements of Yamamoto's invasion force approaching from the northwest. Early the next morning, as dawn spread over the Pacific, waves of U.S. Army Air Force B-17 bombers attacked at extreme range, scoring no hits but alerting Nagumo that his approach had been detected. Still confident, Nagumo launched the first strike at 4:30 a.m. On 4 June, 108 aircraft, led by Commander Mitsuo Fuchida's deputy, Lieutenant Commander Shigekazu Shimazaki, aimed directly at Midway's airfields and defenses. The raid caused heavy damage but failed to destroy the island's ability to launch aircraft. As the first wave returned, Nagumo faced a critical decision. His reserve aircraft were armed with torpedoes for use against ships, but no American fleet had yet been sighted. Reports from his returning flyers demanded a second strike on the island. At 7:15 a.m., he ordered his crews to rearm for another land attack. It was a decision that would cost him dearly. At 7:28, a scout plane from the cruiser Tone reported sighting enemy ships to the east, the American carriers. The timing could not have been worse. Japanese flight decks were crowded with planes being refueled and rearmed when American dive bombers appeared high above them, unseen until the last seconds. At 10:22 a.m., the sky above the Japanese task force erupted in fire and chaos. 3 American squadrons, having found the enemy after hours of desperate searching, dove through clouds of flak in near-suicidal attacks. In less than 6 minutes, Akagi, Kaga, and Soryu were hit by multiple 1,000-pound bombs. Their hangars, filled with fueled aircraft and explosives, became infernos. Pilots waiting on deck were incinerated before they could take off. Only Hiryu survived the initial assault, and she immediately counterattacked, launching 2 strikes that damaged Yorktown so severely it had to be abandoned later that day. But the balance of power had shifted irreversibly. American dive bombers from Enterprise and Hornet located Hiryu in the afternoon and struck with equal ferocity, setting her ablaze. By nightfall, all 4 Japanese carriers were burning wrecks, their surviving crews struggling to abandon ship. Of the 248 aircraft that had launched from the Kido Butai that morning, barely 50 would return. Yamamoto, hundreds of miles to the rear aboard Yamato, received the first garbled reports late in the evening. For hours, he refused to believe them, ordering counterattacks that were never executed. Only at dawn on 5 June did the grim truth reach his flag bridge. The core of Japan's carrier striking power, the force that had brought the empire its victories, was gone. The scale of the disaster stunned even the most loyal officers. More than 3,000 Japanese sailors and airmen had been killed, including some of the Navy's best pilots and flight leaders. 4 carriers and a heavy cruiser had been lost. The Americans, by comparison, lost 1 carrier, Yorktown, and around 300 men. The balance of naval power in the Pacific had shifted decisively. For the first time since Pearl Harbor, Yamamoto faced the reality he had long feared. The United States was now on the offensive. In Tokyo, the news was suppressed for as long as possible, but inside the combined fleet headquarters, the mood turned somber. Yamamoto called his senior staff together and accepted full responsibility. He did not blame Nagumo. "The fault is mine," he said quietly. "The operation was too complex, and I underestimated the enemy." For the next months, he devoted himself to rebuilding the fleet's strength, focusing on the new Shokaku and Zuikaku carriers and the training of replacement pilots. But he knew that the qualitative edge Japan had held at the start of the war was slipping away. The Americans were learning fast, their new carrier doctrine emphasizing coordinated strikes, radar-guided interception, and improved damage control. The factories on the U.S. mainland were producing at levels beyond comprehension. By 1943, America would launch over 38,000 aircraft in a single year and begin constructing carriers faster than Japan could replace its losses. Yamamoto's 6 months of freedom were over. The tide had turned, and the empire he served was now facing an enemy with resources beyond imagination. April 1943. Rabaul, New Britain. The harbor was crowded with ships, destroyers, transports, tenders, and cruisers, their decks scorched by the tropical sun. The air smelled of oil, salt, and aviation fuel. Overhead, the whine of engines filled the sky as Zero fighters took off from Lakunai airfield on another patrol over the Solomon Sea. For months, Rabaul had been the beating heart of Japan's forward operations in the South Pacific. From here, Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto directed the struggle to hold the empire's southern perimeter against the relentless American advance. The defeats at Midway and Guadalcanal had changed everything. No longer did Japan dictate the tempo of the war. It was reacting, trying to slow the enemy's steady push north through the Solomons and New Guinea. The combined fleet had lost irreplaceable pilots, aircraft, and ships, and replacements arriving from the home islands were younger, less experienced, and poorly trained. Yamamoto, now 59, carried the exhaustion of 2 years of continuous command. His black hair had turned almost white, his face lined by worry. Yet to the officers and men who saw him at Rabaul that spring, he remained the symbol of Japan's naval spirit. He still wore the immaculate white uniform, still spoke in his measured, courteous tone, still radiated calm authority. Few knew that the strain was killing him inside. From his command post at Rabaul, Yamamoto coordinated a series of desperate operations to stem the American advance. The Allied victories at Guadalcanal and the Coral Sea had severed Japan's southern lifeline. The once invincible carrier fleet was reduced to a shadow of its former power. U.S. industrial might was now in full motion. American shipyards were launching a new aircraft carrier every month, and thousands of aircraft poured from factories in California, Texas, and Ohio. By early 1943, the balance of power was beyond dispute. American B-24 bombers raided Japanese bases almost daily, and U.S. submarines were strangling Japan's supply routes, sinking tankers and freighters faster than they could be replaced. The empire's vast perimeter, stretching from the Aleutians to New Guinea, was becoming impossible to defend. Yet Yamamoto refused to show despair. In his official communications, he emphasized discipline and resolve. "The spirit of the Navy remains unbroken," he wrote to his subordinates. "Even in adversity, we must show the dignity of the samurai." He planned an inspection tour of frontline bases throughout the Solomons to raise morale among his aircrews, many of whom had not seen a senior officer in months. The itinerary covered more than 1,000 miles, from Rabaul to Balal near Bougainville, with stops at Shortland and Buin. It was meant to be symbolic, the commander-in-chief showing his men that he still shared their danger. But this gesture, born of loyalty, would set in motion the events that ended his life. At the same time, far away in Pearl Harbor, American intelligence was reading Yamamoto's future like an open book. Since Midway, U.S. codebreakers had refined their techniques, penetrating Japanese naval communications with increasing accuracy. The latest version of the JN-25 code, though complex, had been partially deciphered by the specialists of Fleet Radio Unit Pacific, FRUPAC. On 13 April 1943, analysts intercepted a message detailing an inspection itinerary by a high-ranking officer, C-in-C Combined Fleet, including exact times and coordinates of flights between Rabaul and Bougainville on 18 April. The intelligence officer who decrypted it realized instantly who that was: Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto. The decoded schedule specified every takeoff, landing, and escort detail, the kind of precision that allowed only one possible response. Admiral Chester Nimitz forwarded the information to Admiral William Bull Halsey, commander of the South Pacific area, with a single instruction: get Yamamoto. Halsey wasted no time. He called in the 339th Fighter Squadron of the U.S. Army Air Force's 347th Fighter Group, based on Guadalcanal. 16 Lockheed P-38 Lightnings, the only fighters with the range to reach Bougainville and return, were selected. Each was fitted with drop tanks to extend its endurance for the 1,000-mile round trip. The pilots were briefed in absolute secrecy. They were told only that their target was an important Japanese officer. The mission, codenamed Operation Vengeance, would be one of the most audacious interception flights of the war, a precision strike against the architect of Pearl Harbor himself. At 6:00 a.m. on 18 April 1943, Yamamoto boarded a Mitsubishi G4M Betty bomber at Rabaul, accompanied by his chief of staff, Rear Admiral Matome Ugaki, and several aides. They were escorted by 6 Zero fighters from the 204th Air Group. The Admiral was punctual, as always. He was known to reprimand any officer who made him wait even a minute. As the formation climbed into the clear tropical sky, the coastline of New Britain receded beneath them. Yamamoto sat by the window, reading inspection notes and occasionally glancing down at the vast blue sea. At 9:34 a.m., near Bougainville, the American P-38s appeared on the horizon, closing fast from below. The lead flight under Captain Thomas Lanphier spotted the Japanese formation and dove from 8,000 feet. The Zeros turned to engage, but the ambush was perfectly timed. Within seconds, machine gun and cannon fire shredded the lead bomber's engines. Witnesses from the escort fighters later recalled seeing the aircraft roll sharply, trailing black smoke, before plunging into the jungle below. The second bomber, carrying Ugaki, managed a crash landing in a mangrove swamp. The Admiral survived. Yamamoto's plane exploded on impact in dense jungle near the village of Buin. When Japanese search parties reached the wreckage the next day, they found the Admiral's body still seated, sword at his side, white-gloved hands resting on his lap. His watch had stopped at 9:35 a.m., the exact moment the war had lost one of its few men who had understood both its necessity and its futility. April 19, 1943, Rabaul, New Britain. The morning sun rose over Simpson Harbor, but the base was silent. Flags across the anchorage hung at half-mast, and men on the decks of cruisers and destroyers stood motionless, hats removed, faces turned toward the sea. The announcement had come at dawn. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, Commander-in-Chief of the Combined Fleet, was dead. His aircraft had not returned from the Bougainville inspection tour. Radio contact was lost the previous morning, and the worst was now confirmed. In Tokyo, the news was withheld from the public for weeks, but at Rabaul, officers already knew. Rear Admiral Matome Ugaki, recovered from his crash landing, returned to the base pale and expressionless. He brought back the Son, Admiral's personal effects, sword, cap, notebook, and wristwatch, stopped at 9:35 a.m. The medical report confirmed what they had suspected. Yamamoto had died instantly from gunfire wounds to the head and shoulder. For hours, the officers of the fleet stood in silence as the flagship's crew draped black cloth over the bridge railings. The man who had built Japan's modern navy, who had predicted its doom and fought to delay it, was gone. News of the ambush electrified the highest levels of command in both nations. In Washington, President Franklin Roosevelt was informed within hours. The success of Operation Vengeance was celebrated privately, but kept secret from the public to protect American code-breaking operations. Official statements made no mention of Yamamoto by name, only reporting that a Japanese inspection plane was destroyed over the Solomons. In Japan, the impact was profound. When Tokyo finally announced his death on 21st of May 1943, it triggered an outpouring of grief unlike anything since the death of Admiral Togo. Newspapers across the empire carried black borders. Memorial services were held in every naval port. His state funeral, conducted on 5th June at the Hibiya Park Amphitheater, drew more than 250,000 mourners. Emperor Hirohito attended in person, a rare gesture, bowing deeply before the urn containing Yamamoto's ashes. Across the nation, radio stations played solemn marches as citizens bowed their heads in silence. Propaganda broadcasts hailed him as a martyr who had died in flight, leading his men. But among the officer corps, the mood was not just sorrow, it was fear. The one leader who had understood the limits of Japan's power was gone, replaced by men more loyal to pride than to realism. The consequences of Yamamoto's death rippled through the empire's strategy almost immediately. His successor, Admiral Minechi Koga, inherited an exhausted fleet and an impossible mission. The momentum of war had shifted irreversibly to the United States. Within 2 months, American forces invaded New Georgia and the Central Solomons, supported by a growing fleet of carriers, battleships, and transports. The numbers told the story. By mid-1943, the United States was producing 8,000 aircraft per month. Japan managed barely 1,000. The U.S. Navy now operated more than 30 aircraft carriers, including escort and light variants, against Japan's dwindling 10. The shipyards at Pearl Harbor, San Diego, and Puget Sound ran 24 hours a day, repairing damaged vessels faster than Japan could sink them. Meanwhile, Japan's oil reserves were collapsing. Submarine attacks on tankers and supply convoys cut output from the Dutch East Indies by half within a year. By 1944, shortages would cripple the fleet's ability to train and maneuver. Yamamoto had foreseen this. In private conversations before his death, he told aides, "If we cannot end this war soon, we will be overwhelmed by steel and oil." His prophecy was already unfolding. Yet, in another sense, his death transformed him into something larger than life, a symbol of both Japan's early triumph and its coming tragedy. In the post-war years, captured diaries, letters, and official memoranda revealed the complexity of his character. He had opposed the war's beginning, warning Prime Minister Tojo in 1940 that in the first 6 months to a year of war with the United States and Britain, I will run wild and win victory upon victory. But if the war continues beyond that, I have no expectation of success. He had kept that promise exactly. 6 months of victory ended with Midway. After that, the decline was steady, inevitable. Historians would later call Yamamoto the last realist of Japan's high command, a man who understood the enemy's strength because he had seen it firsthand, a graduate of Harvard who admired American industry even as he planned its destruction. When his ashes were divided, part interred at the Tama Cemetery in Tokyo, part buried at his birthplace in Nagaoka, the crowds that gathered were not only mourning a soldier, but an era. He had embodied the paradox of Japan's imperial destiny: brilliance without sustainability, courage without resources, faith without foresight. The empire he served would outlive him by only 2 years. By 1945, when the war ended in flames, the prophecy he had spoken before it began would be fulfilled to the letter. August 1945, Tokyo. Smoke rose over the city that had once been the heart of a modern empire. The streets lay in ruins, flattened by months of bombing raids. The imperial palace stood surrounded by a sea of ashes. In the charred remains of the Naval Staff College at Echujima, a framed portrait of Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto hung crookedly on a blackened wall. It was the only item left untouched by the fire. Officers returning from evacuation bowed quietly before it. 2 years had passed since his death, and in that time Japan's war had unraveled completely. The navy he had once commanded no longer existed as an effective force. Of the 10 aircraft carriers that had once formed the core of the combined fleet, 9 were sunk. The battleship Yamato, which had carried his flag at Midway, was destroyed in April 1945 by hundreds of American aircraft while attempting a suicidal sortie toward Okinawa. The remnants of Japan's once proud fleet lay scattered across the Pacific, rusting hulks at Truk, Rabaul, and Kure. The country's shipyards were silent, its fuel reserves exhausted. In the sky, American bombers flew unopposed. The atomic bombings of Hiroshima on 6 August and Nagasaki on 9 August sealed Japan's fate. On 15 August 1945, Emperor Hirohito's voice, trembling but resolute, was broadcast across the nation. The war situation has developed not necessarily to Japan's advantage, he said, announcing surrender. For many who listened, Yamamoto's long-ago warning echoed in their minds. The war had lasted far beyond 6 months, and it had ended exactly as he had predicted. In the months that followed Japan's surrender, American occupation forces uncovered the extent of Yamamoto's foresight. His personal diaries and correspondence, preserved by his aides, revealed a man torn between loyalty and logic. He had served faithfully, but his letters to friends spoke of despair. In one 1941 letter to a senior politician, he wrote, "If I am told to fight, I will run wild for 6 months, but after that, I can promise nothing." His prediction had been exact. From December 1941 to June 1942, Japan had triumphed. After that, defeat followed with mathematical certainty. At the Tokyo War Crimes Tribunal in 1946, American prosecutors examined records of the Pearl Harbor attack and subsequent campaigns. While Yamamoto was posthumously accused of planning the surprise strike, his name was never included among those charged. Even his enemies recognized his sense of honor. Admiral William Halsey, who had ordered the mission that killed him, later remarked, "Yamamoto was a gallant enemy. It was an honor to have fought him." Other American officers, reading translations of his speeches and reports, found a strategist haunted by inevitability. He had opposed the Axis alliance, warned against attacking America, and repeatedly argued for a diplomatic settlement. Yet when duty demanded, he had carried out his orders with precision and restraint. The war had consumed him as surely as it consumed his country. In post-war Japan, Yamamoto became both legend and lesson. His ashes, interred in Nagaoka beside his family shrine, drew thousands of visitors each year. Veterans placed naval caps and flowers at his grave, whispering prayers to the man they still called Teitoku, the Admiral. School textbooks portrayed him as a tragic hero, the samurai who foresaw disaster but obeyed his emperor's will. In American historical memory, he was the enemy mastermind of Pearl Harbor, yet also the admiral who fell victim to the same precision he once wielded. Over time, historians came to view his career as the embodiment of Japan's 20th century paradox, modern brilliance chained to imperial illusion. He had built a navy that rivaled any in the world, but within an economy that could never sustain it. He had trained aviators capable of miracles, yet sent them into battles where replacements did not exist. His death removed the last voice in Tokyo that had understood the industrial war America was fighting, a war not of ships and guns alone, but of factories, logistics, and endurance. When the new Japan emerged in the 1950s, rebuilt under American guidance, some of Yamamoto's former officers helped design its modern self-defense forces. They often quoted their fallen commander's words, "A navy must be built not on glory, but on the foundation of a nation's strength." That idea, ignored in 1941, had become the blueprint for Japan's recovery. By the 1960s, as peace returned to the Pacific, the story of Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto became the bridge between former enemies. American veterans visited Nagaoka to pay their respects. In 1960, when the U.S. Navy's Pacific Fleet conducted joint exercises with Japan's Maritime Self-Defense Force for the first time, the ceremony began with a moment of silence in his honor. The irony was inescapable. The admiral who once sought to destroy the U.S. Pacific Fleet had, through his warnings and sacrifice, helped shape the peace that united the two nations. His secret plan, the surprise that nearly sank America's naval power in 1941, had succeeded beyond expectation, but doomed his cause. The smoke over Pearl Harbor had announced Japan's moment of supremacy. The silence at Nagaoka symbolized its reflection. In the end, Yamamoto's life traced the full arc of his nation's journey. Ambition, brilliance, overreach, ruin, and renewal. His ghost lingered wherever the sea met the sky, a reminder that victory built on illusion is only the first step toward defeat, and that foresight, even when ignored, leaves its mark on history.